I think building communities and building networks are foundational to markets for all the reasons we've been discussing. That's absolutely been one of the three pillars of ABEX. Sometimes it gets questioned. Why is an exchange building a podcast? Why is an exchange launching a community? It's because, that in my mind, particularly where information technology is headed, is going to be an essential, if not the essential piece of market building.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by ABEX Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, and battery metals markets. Smarter Markets are here.
Welcome back to Smarter Markets. It's a holiday weekend here in the United States, and we thought that would make it a good time to revisit some of the big ideas that our guests have shared with us over this past year. Meeting the new commercial realities created by the globalization of the natural gas market, the energy transition to a lower carbon economy, and the rise of artificial intelligence requires new and smarter markets in which participants are empowered with the latest financial technology. And building those smarter markets will require big ideas. We hope you enjoy revisiting some of these moments and guests and ideas with us this morning. Our guests featured on this episode include Robert Friedland, founder and executive chairman at Ivanhoe Mines; Brad Hitch, director of LNG trading at EQT Corporation; Samantha Dart, head of natural gas research at Goldman Sachs; Susan Sackmar, visiting professor, the University of Houston, and board member, Flex LNG; Mark Lewis, head of research at Onderon Capital; Hannah Howman, global head of carbon trading at Trafigura; Andy Home, senior metals columnist at Thomson Reuters; Andrea Hodder, special correspondent, Fast Markets; Ben Hunt, author of Epsilon Theory and co-founder and CIO at Second Foundation Partners; Michelle Dennedy, chief data strategy officer at ABEX Technologies; Dr. David Bray, distinguished chair of the Accelerator and CEO principal at the Stimson Center and LDA Ventures Incorporated; and Josh Crum, founder and CEO of ABEX Technologies. You can find their full episodes on our website at smartermarkets.media or on all major podcast platforms. And now let's get started. And for that, we'll turn to Robert Friedland to set the stage.
That's a very big and very important and fundamental question. Since we started this podcast, and 200 have gone out into the universe now, we have been subjected to an absolute blizzard of misinformation and disinformation about what constitutes an energy transition and what critical raw materials we need to get there from here. So we can separate out the existential question, what the two words energy transition means, then we can settle on the critical raw materials. We'll just note that the Mediterranean Sea was hotter last summer than ever recorded. There are over 600 water tornadoes in the Mediterranean Sea. We'll take it as a given that the anecdotal experience of the hot weather the last few years globally supports the thesis that we have anthropomorphic global warming and that we need an energy transition. However, for 1 billion people, an energy transition is for the woman of the household just to be able to cook with natural gas rather than wood. So let's set aside the words energy transition for a moment. We should probably come back to that and talk about critical raw materials. If you want to electrify the world economy, if that's what we're talking about in energy transition, clean electrical energy that does not generate global warming gas, and that does not exacerbate or trigger an even more critical cycle of the Earth warming itself. Because as it gets to a certain temperature, we could melt the polar ice caps, we could release huge amounts of trapped methane that are frozen in northern Russia, for example, into the atmosphere. And we could get into a reinforcing cycle where global warming gets even hotter because we trigger sort of a greenhouse effect. Setting all that aside, there is essentially an ocean of disinformation and misinformation about the critical raw materials required. So let's go into that and let's peel that onion and get some people to understand a little bit about it.
So let's peel that onion and listen to our guests discuss the state of play in these key energy transition commodity markets. Let's start with Brad Hitch, Samantha Dart, and Susan Sackmar, talking about LNG and the globalizing natural gas market.
It's an incredibly vibrant time for the market. The U.S. is over 100 cargoes a month at this point in time. It's pretty remarkable that it's done that within the space of 10 years, really. Less than 10 years, actually, when you go back to when the first projects got off the ground. You're continuing to see more and more new entrants, players of all shapes and sizes taking cargoes out on an FOB basis sometimes, U.S. volumes going all over the world. So it's an incredibly exciting moment we've reached, and it's not peaking yet. There's plenty more to come. So it's great.
And I was hoping you could put some of that size and the development of the market into some context for us. We often talk about the globalization of natural gas markets through LNG. How does what's happening in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico today compare to what was happening, say, in the North Sea during the formation of the Brent crude oil market in the 1980s?
That is a very good comparison, in my opinion, because, as the Brent contract was kind of gaining momentum, obviously within the North Sea, you had what was deemed to be and what was in fact a really good basis for starting that contract, in the sense that you had 60, 70 cargoes a month, something like that at the peak. And you had a lot of different players. So you had majors, you had traders. There was a good sort of distribution of companies that were in the North Sea at the time. If you compare that, though, to where we are in the Gulf today, well, now you're over 100 cargoes and growing in the Gulf at the moment. You've got dozens. I think I stopped counting when the number hit 25 or something a few years ago, in terms of players that have either primary capacity in the original terminals where they're either tolling or taking long-term contracts, or whether, there also have been some companies that have come in and bought primary capacity from some of the original holders, and doing that kind of further fragmenting the supply side. But what's also really important about the growth of the U.S. market is that it's predominantly an FOB trade, which means that the volumes can go anywhere. It's coming from a wholesale market, which is radically different from the only other real example of LNG being pulled from a wholesale market is LNG coming out of Eastern Australia specifically. It has the ability to kind of be the volume that the market swings on. If you look through time, you've had big producing volumes, or you've had big concentration of volumes in single locations in the past in LNG, but you've never had that concentration of volume coupled with a completely fragmented supply side, and coupled with the ability for players to take those cargoes where they're needed most at whatever time. So, winter they go to Asia, summer they go to Europe, vice versa, South America during drier periods, Middle East when it's hot. They really can be the balancing volume for the market. And that's, I think, helping the LNG become a much more global and kind of more dependable commodity for a lot of new entrants.
Samantha Dart, Head of Natural Gas Research at Goldman Sachs.
If you think about the size of the market today, we're talking about upcoming capacity additions equivalent to about 50% of the size of the current market. But I think the most important stat is not even that one. It's the fact that you're adding, let's say, between 2025 and 2029, you're adding about 200 million tons of LNG, when your average demand growth out of Asia for LNG imports is less than 20. So it just doesn't add up, right? And it gives you a pretty good sense of what's to come. We're likely to be not just oversupply, but extremely oversupplied. And then we think that the way to balance the market is exactly with prices falling, looking for a home, looking for new demand, new ways to absorb all of that LNG. So it's difficult to avoid that type of scenario when the scale of supply growth is that large.
And what do you think has been driving all the investment in LNG export capacity?
part of that investment happened after the crisis, or during the crisis, I should say. And to remind, natural gas prices really took off before even the Ukraine war started. If you go back to really the spring of 2021, that's when we had a big weather event in Europe that triggered the process of gas becoming more expensive than coal. That happened to be a tight summer. And it was really the fall of 2021 when Russia started to cut spot sales to Europe. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. And then the spike in prices took really a different scale. Some projects did reach FID after that happened, but a lot of other projects that are coming online over the next few years, they have been under construction for quite a few years. Some of them were FID back in 18, a lot of them in 2019. So it's cyclical nature of the investment, right? And what we expect going forward is exactly because we have this wall of LNG just about to hit us in the face. You're going to have this pressure prices lower and somewhat reduce the incentive for new investment to happen for a few years, right? So it's a wall now. It'll lead to a bear cycle in the market over the next several years, but the outcome of that should be absorbing all that glut of LNG because you're going to dry up new projects and lower prices are going to create more demand. So we live in this cyclical industry, don't we?
Susan Sackmar, visiting professor, the University of Houston, and board member, Flex LNG. I wanted to turn to you, Susan, and ask, as we've got this booming U.S. LNG export industry that's continuing to grow, how central is Europe to the business plans of U.S. oil and gas producers, of LNG exporters? And how important are European environmental policies to their business plans? Now, are they focused particularly on the European market, or was it really just kind of the broader global export markets?
I think Europe is very important. I think all of the U.S. projects, with the exception of Freeport, maybe, which is all Japanese off-takers, the U.S. projects do have a lot of European off-takers. And one thing that's really important is your off-taker for the U.S. model needs to be creditworthy. And so the European off-takers are creditworthy. A lot of emerging Asia off-takers are not creditworthy. And so the U.S. LNG model really relies on the creditworthiness of the buyer. So I think Europe is very important in that regard. So I think Europe is important. And I think when you look at, for example, Cheniere, and you mentioned methane and the European regulations, I think Cheniere is a company that stands out to me as saying Europe is important and we will do what needs to be done to ensure our U.S. LNG will have a home in Europe and comply with European regulations. So I feel like some of the companies, especially Cheniere, which is the largest U.S. LNG exporter, is taking the lead on looking at methane emissions from the source of the natural gas, from the gas that's being sourced. And Cheniere just released a new life cycle emission study that they think will comply and meet European regulations. And these are the regulations that are going to impact the imports of US LNG in a couple of years. I've been saying sort of on social media that I do think there needs to be, I'm calling it harmonization, but that's sort of a term of art. I think there probably needs to be some more coordination between the US government and European governments in terms of how the European regulations are going to roll out so that US LNG isn't excluded. And I just the other day saw something come across social media that the US and Europe are looking at that. So I think under Trump, we're going to see a lot more and hear a lot more about how European regulations will impact US LNG. I think that is still coming because in my view, it's a bit unclear how the European regulations, how they're going to be implemented. And I think from what I've heard from some lawyers, it's a bit unclear on European buyers. Can they sign new US LNG deals and will those deals be valid in 20 years if European regulations are now requiring European buyers to look at the emissions of the full value chain, which is pretty hard to do, right? A European buyer, has to look at the emissions of the full value chain of US gas. I mean, it's hard for US producers to come up with that number. And now we're sort of putting that on European buyers to make sure that it's going to meet the European regulations. So I think under President Trump, we're going to hear a lot more about that and how that's going to roll out.
Let's follow this discussion of the role of European policy on these markets into the carbon markets. And for that, we'll turn to Mark Lewis and Hannah Hellman.
The EU ETS is still very much the global benchmark compliance market, still the largest market, the most liquid, daily auctions, so pricing in real time with very decent liquidity, 35,000 to 40,000 lots traded every day on the EU ETS across the strip, still mostly in the front year contract, but that's 35 to 40 million tons a day being traded notional in the carbon futures market. So it's a very sophisticated, deep, liquid market with a very wide range of players. The compliance players, obviously, the power companies and the industrial companies that have compliance obligations under the scheme, and then different kinds of financial players, banks who are in there on behalf of industrial companies very often, then hedge funds and speculative funds such as ourselves, who are looking to trade the pricing arbitrage opportunities and look for opportunities whether across the curve or between EUAs and other carbon markets. And we'll certainly get into that later in the conversation because at the moment, right now, I think probably the most interesting opportunity in compliance markets is in the UK and narrowing the discount to EUAs. And we'll come back on that. But that's kind of the state of the nation in terms of why the EU ETS is still very much the benchmark market for compliance schemes globally, the one that people look at. And one other feature of it, of course, that I should have mentioned in that summary is it's the longest in existence. It's been going since 2005. And crucially, Dave, and I think this is a point that is often easy to forget in the day-to-day excitement of trading this market, we are now halfway through the lifetime of this market. It started in 2005. The cap is falling to zero by 2040. So this is a market that's been up and running for 20 years, and basically it's only got another 15 years to go. At least as the legislation is currently written, we will see what happens as these geopolitical pressures from Donald Trump kick in and tariffs potentially kick in. But right now, we're over the halfway mark in the lifetime of this market, and the rubber is about to hit the road in a big way. Because coming back to your question, just trying to set the scene again, where we are in terms of the development of the market, a very, very key development. Next year, we have the CBAM, so-called CBAM Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is effectively a carbon tariff that the European Union will place on imports of goods covered by the scheme to ensure that European producers are not at a disadvantage in their own market from foreign producers of steel and cement and so on. And this is going to change, we think, market participants' behavior. And perhaps just to step back a little and explain to our audience the significance of this. I mean, this is a market that from day one, so from the 1st of January 2005, where price formation has been driven by the power sector, the power generation sector, right? They have always had this obligation, certainly from 2008, they've been under an obligation to buy all of their allowances at auction, whereas the industrial sector receives still a very significant share of their overall allocation for free, precisely because of this problem of competitiveness with countries outside the EU who produce the same goods. And what that means is it's been the power sector that has driven price formation. They're the ones who've had to hedge forward and take carbon pricing into account when they're selling their power forward. It's essentially just another commodity like coal or gas that they're using for their power generation. They buy coal and they buy carbon. They buy gas and they buy carbon. And because they hedge forward typically, they sell their power on a rolling 3-year forward basis. That's why they have always been the main driver of prices. Now, of course, Europe is decarbonizing in the power sector very quickly. We have renewable energy capacity coming onto the system every year and it is displacing the older fossil fuel generation capacity. And what this means structurally, the European power industry is reducing its emissions from year to year simply by virtue of the fact that more and more renewable capacity is coming onto the system. And what that means in turn is we need the industrial sector to step up and start hedging their forward liabilities in the same way that the power sector in the past did, but in the future will not be doing, because they have less and less of a requirement to do that, because more and more of their generation collectively is coming from renewable sources. So I think this is an absolutely crucial moment in the development of the EU ETS, which will be watched very closely by other jurisdictions that have compliance markets, because the EU ETS, as we have known and loved it since its inception, is going to go through a big identity change as industrials step up to take over from utilities as the main driver of prices. I liken it, Dave, to a relay race where the power generation sector has been running the first lap or the first few laps around the stadium, and we're now getting into the box where they hand over the baton to the industrial sector, and they have to step up and take responsibility for driving prices. So that's a long answer to your question, but just to give a flavor of, where we are in the market, the day-to-day liquidity, the main participants, and how we're thinking about these significant structural changes that are coming and the pricing opportunities that inevitably will arise from that. Because what we're looking at now, between now and the end of this decade, and in fact all the way down to 2040 now, is annual deficits where demand is outstripping supply. So we should start to see prices move structurally higher over the next 5 years, between now and 2030, as we find that abatement price point for industry. What's the price at which industry can reduce emissions? That's where the price has to go. Now, is it 100, 150, 200? That's what the market will have to figure out over the next 2 to 3 years.
Hannah Howman, Global Head of Carbon Trading at Trafigura.
So as you said, we'll talk a lot about Europe today, but in reality, this is a trend that we're seeing playing out globally. Specifically, that governments are increasing their pace on legislation, quite ironically, as corporates are starting to slow the pace on their side. So what we're now seeing is really the inflection point as that government policy is now actually conforming into policy, legislation, and ultimately law. And these really take different kind of forms and shapes, and you mentioned a few of those. But the way to think about the overarching framework and how they work together is we have elements like CSRD, which is really talking about carbon accounting. We have the CRCF, which is talking about carbon removals or the quality of what a net and net zero looks like. And then finally, the EU green claims, which is exactly what it sounds like, talking about how companies actually account for their emissions reporting, how they communicate this to investors and consumers alike.
I want to take it now to the last piece of regulation, the EU Green Claims Directive, which regulates how companies may talk about what they're doing on the climate side. And when you look at that, how does that regulation of the claims that can be made, what is that requiring, and why is that important to putting together these three legs of the stool, I guess?
I'm going to use some words that you may have heard previously, words like standardization, objectivity, robustness, no different to, let's say, that demand side of the equation, which is that emissions accounting. We need to define the quality, but then we also need to define how that is actually being used in the market and on what basis. So today we see a lot of descriptions in retail goods, in corporate advertising, whether that be carbon neutral or low carbon. There's not really clarity on what that means as we look product to product and firm to firm. So what's really interesting about the EU Green Claims Directive is we're now getting, in effect, a gap accounting version of what is the appropriate way to claim offsets, talk about decarbonization process, and really actually define what makes a product carbon neutral or low carbon, and what were the scientific objective measures that companies used to get there. So what we're really looking at going forward is kind of this concept of calorific content that we think about when we think about food. But again, moving more towards what is that objectively low carbon number, not just descriptive, categorical.
And so now we put these three pieces together. We have a regulatory definition of what constitutes a ton of a carbon emissions reduced or removed, rules on how a green claim, including a net zero claim, may be made, and those claims now carrying the legal weight of financial reporting. So how do you see this regulatory approach reshaping the way we need to be thinking about the potential path forward in the carbon markets?
What's interesting about this is, as you mentioned, this is the three-legged stool. They look from the surface as though they are three very independent regulatory tracks. But in reality, they're all moving at the same pace and really seeking to deliver at the same time for good reason. And that's really because we're moving out of what I would say is a pure voluntary kind of guise of what corporate action looks like, as we are now not only regulating the claims, but we are also regulating the underlying accounting and progression of those targets. So as we move forward, I think we're thinking less about these as completely two separate types of markets in terms of voluntary and regulatory. And we're really thinking about regulated markets, which in their own right are already increasing in terms of sectors, geographies, products that they extend to, but now also a regulated corporate commitments market, which is now really, again, moving away from that sustainability report that's primarily focused on graphics and much more focused on what are the objective measures that companies are taking towards climate action? And again, how do they compete on the basis of decarbonization and progression towards targets?
And the carbon markets aren't the only market in which the energy transition hasn't gone the way people thought it would go, as Andy Home and Andrea Hodder explain in the battery metals markets. You said that the energy transition hasn't stopped, but it just hasn't gone the way people thought it would go. And in this podcast series where we're discussing the state of play in the battery metals markets, I thought that would be the perfect place for us to pick up the conversation. And I saw that you wrote recently in one of your articles that 2024 was, in your words, a brutal year to be in the battery metals business.
Let's take a little step back. Let's look at, what's been going on in these markets for the last 4 or 5 years. So 2021, 2022, it was a rip-roaring bull market. Do you remember? Cobalt, nickel, lithium, they were all going absolute gangbusters. Everyone was super excited about the EV revolution and, the exponential demand growth forecast that we were all looking at. Okay, each one of them crashed in 2022, 2023. Nickel started it, cobalt followed, lithium was last, right? We're back to sort of like where we were. But here's what happened in 2024. Nothing. They just kept on grinding steadily lower. You're getting into absolute producer pain levels, right? So we've got an industry that just 3 or 4 years ago, it was kind of like me trying to expand capacity like there was no tomorrow. We were told that the world was going to run out of this stuff. This last year, you had just seen a string of casualties, right? Plants have been closed. New mines have been mothballed. Everyone's sort of like, pushed back, any sort of investment plans, right? So this is a very, very difficult market for anyone trying to sort of like get into the battery metals business. It's a difficult market for those already in the battery metals business, right? Demand has turned out to be the really unpredictable part of our market equation, right? In terms of moving units, absolutely. It seems subsidies work for consumers, whether they're living in Beijing, London, or San Francisco, right? But here's the thing. Not all electric vehicles are made alike. And one of the big surprises, I think for me personally, but I think for the market as a whole, is when we talk about electric vehicles and battery metals, I think most of us are thinking of a Tesla-style vehicle, pure battery driven, right? Actually, the vehicles that sell much better than pure battery are hybrids. The world's car buyers really like hybrids, plug-in hybrids, full hybrids, extended range hybrids. And that applies to the Chinese as well, where hybrids are the rage, right? But here's the problem. Battery in a hybrid, about a third of the size and a third of the power in one of the pure battery electric vehicle, right? Which means what? Yeah, a third less of all the materials are going in to make that battery. A lot of the batteries being used now change the chemistry, just lithium iron phosphate. No nickel, no cobalt, no manganese. So demand in terms of vehicles going up, so 25% growth in global electric vehicles last year, right? But that's not the same as saying that's the equivalent demand for the metals, because sort of cars which are really moving fast are the hybrid models using less metals, right? This is the market.
Andrea Hodder, special correspondent, Fast Markets. I would think that you've had a lot of the producers, in particular outside of China, in these metals sectors struggling. And one of the benefits that China has is there's been such an alignment through the government, through the supply chain of the direction they're moving in. And it sounds now like Western producers are kind of having to take a step back because you don't want to commit a lot of capital if there's just too much uncertainty about the future. So I'm curious, it seems like this could kind of tilt the odds against Western producers a little bit more. I mean, there's always a chance that the easier permitting, potentially some subsidies, some other things that are done can help give them a boost competitively. But it would seem like just the ambiguity has got to be making them pause a lot of decision making and lead to less investment in the near term.
I think it's interesting. I think you need to differentiate between producers investing in the US and companies outside the US. And I think, it was quite evident from some of the comments. Again, a lot of the producers are being quite cautious about what they say, but we've heard some of the Australian producers in their earnings this week, lithium companies say, well, the energy transition hasn't stopped just because of this. This is carrying on with or without the US. We are still pushing ahead with our projects. So I think once you've invested that capital, once you've committed to it, I think it's really hard to pull back, particularly in all of these massive projects abroad where you've got jobs reliant on it, you've got investment that's already happened, and you have your own targets to meet within those various countries. So to a certain extent, it's really important for the US market and for investment in the US, but you do have to look at the rest of the world as it's still really important to the energy transition. And the US might have pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but all the other countries that are its signatories have not, and they still have their targets to meet. So I think we really need to be aware of that. And I think the other thing to think of is this material will just flow somewhere else. We saw during the Ukraine and Russia war, when that started, that material started to reroute, and you could do business with some countries and you couldn't do it with others. And we saw who would do business with who, and that material is still there. It's just going to different places that it did before. So I think a similar kind of thing will start to happen in terms of trade flows, in terms of projects and capital investment amongst producers. Yeah, it would probably give me pause if I didn't think that I was going to get tax credits and so on, and it's suddenly skyrocketed costs. But I think if you already made the investment and you're already committed, the money's in the ground and you're doing it, then pausing that project, it would be hard to find a reason to. But again, anything's possible. Anything can happen. In theory, the US still wants to push ahead with its drive to procure and produce critical minerals for its supply chain. So it wants many of those to be produced domestically, which suggests that if you are a producer and you want to invest in the US, your money should be welcome. What form that takes, I don't know. Maybe the Inflation Reduction Act, like I said, maybe it gets renamed something else, because maybe it becomes the Trump Natural Resources Act. I don't know, but I'm being a little flippant here. All I'm trying to say is I don't think that push has gone away. I just think maybe it's become a little more politicized. And once we get over that, I think that you might find that the goals and ambitions are probably the same.
Building these new markets to meet the new commercial realities of the energy transition also requires making them smarter. And new technologies such as artificial intelligence have been redefining what is possible. Ben Hunt, author of Epsilon Theory, joined us to talk about how the rise of artificial intelligence and large language models isn't just a technological revolution, it's a linguistic one, a transformation in how we perceive, construct, and share meaning.
I'll start with something close to home. I mean, how we're actually using it in our work. I've been trying to think of the best way to describe this. What we do in our day job is we're trying to find the semantic structures in unstructured data. That's a $10 phrase, semantic structures. the examples I like to give, if I'm talking to somebody from Hollywood, I say, well, an example of semantic structure is the hero's journey, right? It's that old story. It's a story arc. It's a script. It's a narrative archetype. I mean, there are thousands of different scripts and movies that use the hero's journey as their base, different characters, different settings, different words to describe it. But what we mean by semantic structure is that it's one story. It's one coherent story. And the kicker is that, I really believe this, is that we humans are hardwired to respond to that story, that our brains are wired not just for grammatical structures, but I think even more so for semantic structures, for story arcs and archetypes, as I'm describing. Now, in Wall Street and investing, an example of semantic structure might be, well, we're bullish on the new thing. Right? Again, can take 1,000 different forms, not dependent on what the new thing is. It's dependent on telling a story in a certain way that we humans are also hardwired to respond to. We start paying attention to that new thing. We start getting excited about the new thing. So that's what we try to do in our day job. And our initial cracks at this, and I've been working with language. We didn't call it large language models. We didn't call it natural language processing 30 years ago, 35 years ago now. My God, we're getting old. But that's what it was. You know, the math hasn't changed. The linguistic approach hasn't changed. But what has changed is just the raw firepower that's at our fingertips. The artificial intelligence of a large language model, I like to call it a non-human intelligence. Artificial, that makes it seem fake. It's not a fake intelligence. It's a real intelligence. But it's also profoundly not human intelligence. We've all seen, I think, the cartoon of the Shoggoth monster with the million eyes and kind of the jelly monster, that this is what a large language model is. And we put a pleasant face on it through our training and our reinforcement learning and stuff like that. But it's a very non-human kind of monstrous thing back there. We said, okay, let's use that as our engine. Let's build a back end and a front end large language model as, I'm mixing all my metaphors here, but as our steam engine here, as our source of energy. And maybe we'll catch more fish. I bet we catch some old shoes as well. Our expectation was, okay, we'll be catching a lot more fish. We're building a much bigger net. We'll get a lot more signal from incorporating large language models directly into our technology stack. We'll get a lot more signal, but the signal probably won't be as high a quality as the signal we got from Ben and Rusty thinking really hard about a problem. And in fact, when we built our new net, put it into the pond, we caught a lot of fish, a lot more fish, like 10x more fish. The crazy thing, though, Dave, was that we didn't get more false positives. We got a lot less. It wasn't just that the amount of signal increased dramatically, like by a factor, like 10x, but the quality of the signal improved as well.
But while this kind of intelligence lets us see more, it also raises hard questions about control, autonomy, and how our digital environments shape us in return.
You know, anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of social media. I hated reading him in grad school, Foucault, because, you know, he writes in a language that's intentionally obtuse and difficult to understand. But the concept, again, not original to him, but to Jeremy Bentham, the notion of the panopticon, the most effective prison in the world is not the one with the most guards. It's the one where you think someone's always watching you. If you think that what you're doing is always being recorded and could be used against you, man, that constrains your behavior so much more than anything else that can happen. I really feel like we build our own mental panopticons in our prisons. No, I can't change my mind on this political candidate or this sports person or this, you know, this celebrity. No, I'm on team this or team that. because we've outsourced our consciousness, right? And so it's so difficult to reclaim that for ourselves, that autonomy for ourselves. I think the only way we can do it is to find those small groups of friends, and have conversations where we work things out and talk about stuff without worrying that it's going to be stuck in your ribs.
Such a novel invention, the friend. And I wanted to ask you, like, for doing this, we've been building our own coffee house and thinking about how the format of our digital communication alters the content, alters how people engage with it. I think the original character limit on tweets was a great example. Like, remember when that first came out, it seemed like, what are you going to say in so few characters? But it completely changes the way people communicated with each other. I'm curious, like, how do you think about, do we need to change some of these formats? Because I don't know what the analogy to form follows function is in language, but is kind of the content of our communication, the content of our thinking being shaped and constrained by the formats we're able to communicate in.
Do you read books anymore, Dave?
Seldom, unfortunately.
Me too.
It's gotten much shorter form.
Me too. I want to be a book reader. I used to be a book reader. And we can be honest here, I don't read books anymore. I buy a lot of books because I want to be a book reader. The book has become really a totem to me. It's less of a source of information, entertainment. Honestly, books have become just like a totem, an object that make me feel better to have around me, but that I don't use instrumentally the way I used to. I can force myself, I guess, maybe to become a book reader again. I don't think that's a winning formula. I think that we have to recognize how we have been changed by the pervasive sociopathy of the system, by the technology that is both this enormous and incredible energy source, as we started off this conversation, and is an energy source that can be used against us. I think what we have to do, Dave, is not try to force ourselves into the old ways. My God, we're all going to become book readers again, and we're going to like it. I think I just got to admit to myself that I like having books because they make me feel good to have around, but I ain't going to read them. Not the way I used to. I think that by using what we've got, which is this enormous form of energy and invention in the form of large language models and that non-human intelligence, really to create extensions of ourselves, not to outsource our consciousness, but to leverage our consciousness, man, that gets me kind of excited. And I know that that's a big part. I think that's a big part of what you guys are working here, that it's a place to have trusted circles of conversation. And it's, I'll say, native to digital agents and using large language models to extend our consciousness, not to outsource it.
As Ben Hunt explained, large language models internalize the stories we feed them. And in an age where data is the raw material of intelligence, the systems we use to collect, store, and monetize that data matter more than ever. But what happens when data becomes a commodity, traded, hoarded, and reused across invisible supply chains? And what does that mean for our privacy, identity, and agency in the age of artificial intelligence? Let's discuss this with Michelle Dennedy and Dr. David Bray.
The quantity and the quality of the damage in this kind of situation is over time. So right now, I think the immediate damage is more spectral than actual. But I think there's sort of two mind thoughts here. One, why aren't we talking about this more? Why aren't we hearing all the commentators being afraid, wringing their hands, et cetera, et cetera? And I think it's partially because we've become numb. We keep hearing about breach after breach. We're spending trillions of dollars on security measures and security leaders and fancy C-suite designations for people. And yet we continue to have these massive bunches So the other side of this is it's a massive bunch. I mean, we're talking about billions of records. Unfortunately, I think this is the beginning of an era. Now that we understand that data and training data and data supply is a market, a new market that is allowing for this boomtown of ML and AI, this is the beginning.
I want to talk about the value of that currency, as you put it, with you, because from our earlier conversations on the podcast, one of my big takeaways has been that we all need to understand that our data is a highly valued commodity with an entire industry around it that most of us are not even aware of. And much like people learned about physical supply chains over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, people now need to learn about data supply chains. So how do we get started thinking about this data industry and the data supply chains that support it?
It's really important to, I think, start with the foundations. Let's go back to the mortgage crisis of 2008. Why was anyone able to resell a mortgage that was given out to a person with very little credentialing, if any? We had people who had no employment or very low employment able to take out a lot of money with absolutely no backing whatsoever. Well, we were able to do that because we were able to bundle these things into packages and then resell those packages. You never would have said, oh, look, it's a 18-year-old kid with 2 months of bartending behind him. Of course, we'll give him a home loan. You never would do that. So part of the reason with privacy, to kind of like move into that analogy, is the companies that are selling and reselling your information don't necessarily care about you, the individual. So for the longest time, particularly in ad tech, where we're making money by displaying things, quote unquote, for free, by sucking information about the use and the viewing of those ads, the use of those services, the companies were able to say, I don't care about Michelle Dennedy. I'm going to call her Michelle X. We'll call that anonymized. We'll put her in a bundle with all the Michelle X-like creatures, and we'll start to auction off that attention to the highest bidder. And over time, we've seen regulations sort of try to catch up with that. But understanding that we as a group of people are very important to the world economy in the digital world, buying and reselling. But we're also really important to understanding how we are a fundamental part of how the sausage is actually being made. We are not just viewing ads. So what we're doing to try to understand how we interact, particularly with software, but it all trickles all the way back. The software is running somewhere in reality. Our quote unquote cloud services are all attached to actual servers and computers and databases. So it's software, it's hardware, it's HVAC, it's energy. How are we having all of this data flow, and how is it equally flowing? It's easy in that complexity and that expense to forget each individual element. So we are all sort of the blood flow. And that's why I say data is not oil. Data is a currency because it's contextual.
Dr. David Bray, Distinguished Chair of the Accelerator and CEO Principal at the Stimson Center and LDA Ventures Incorporated. And I want to go back to something you brought up before, which is trust, because that seems like that's one of the fundamental hard problems at play here as we change the whole nature of the means by which we interact with one another. I really appreciate your definition, and I want to repeat it because I think it bears repeating, where you said you define trust as the willingness to be vulnerable to actors whose actions you cannot control. And I think that's really worth spending some time thinking about. And when I think about trust and the loss of trust that we've experienced in our digital communications, it reminds me of an old quote in a slightly different context, which was, it'd say the problem with losing the ability to know who to trust isn't that you believe nothing, it's that you're capable of believing anything. It's not that you trust nothing, it's like you might trust who knows what. So my question is, how do you think we go about rebuilding trust in our digital communications?
It's proven hard to figure out how do you put identities on the internet in a way that at the same time protects people from a surveillance state occurring. because the very thing that authenticates that it's you or authenticates it's me, unfortunately makes it really easy for surveillance to be done either for government means or for corporate means. We lose the ability to have consent about when that's done or not. And then, yes, there are efforts afoot. Maybe one day we'll figure it out. But I would say right now, if anything, there are countries, one that's 1.3, 1.4 billion people that have already rolled out their version of the internet in which everybody is surveilled, everybody is known. Not great. It's not consistent with what I consider to be a free society, but that's what they have chosen. I'm going to give a different path, which says what matters in free societies is the ability that you can be pseudonymous. You can actually be anonymous if you want to as well. Now, maybe because you're anonymous, you're not going to get the fast lane on getting an airplane. You may not even get on an airplane at all if you don't give some identity. But if you give some identity, you can get on an airplane. If you give even more information, you get into the TSA pre-line. But what's even more important is the provenance of data. And what do I mean by that, where did it come from and who or what did it come from? And in some respects, identity is a little bit into it, but it's focusing on the data versus who you are. Because that gets necessary because one, as we try to try and figure out what's more authentic versus inauthentic, what do I want to believe versus what I don't want to believe? I mean, that's what the intelligence community does, is they pull information from different sources. They have different degrees of confidence in those sources. And as a result, they try to complete the whole picture. And I think if we're going to find any solution that allows individuals to do the same thing, we have to start with, how do you know that that's really coming from a source that in general has been more right than wrong over the last 3 to 4 years? Or is something that I'm willing to say they actually did some vetting? And again, you may choose and say, look, I'm also going to include sources that I know are politically biased, but they're part of my team and that's okay. And that's fine. But if we can focus on the provenance of data, that helps solve issues for corporations trying to figure out, what are we going to do about this market or this supply chain? That helps communities figure out, which is this a reliable source of news about what's impacting us at the local level or the national level? And finally, it helps us deal with the fact that we're increasingly going to have synthetic information and machine-delivered information. And how do I know that what this machine was trained on is anything that's reliable, let alone if the machine itself, whatever it's giving me, is reliable too?
And we'll finish out the discussion with Josh Crum, taking us into the next chapter of Smarter Markets, where digital identity, verifiable titles, and collateralized assets come together to build smarter markets for global trade.
That is a problem. And I think our minds can't even get our head around some of the things that are going to happen as a result of generative AI. And the fact that these centralized data model, as much business trust architectures as you can put in place, it's going to disrupt things sort of incalculably at this point. So I think, we always kind of had that vision that, we needed to really go down to the first principles and really, really think about trust infrastructure, both from a business infrastructure and workflow, as well as, the actual IT systems that support that. That's always been a core of ABEX, is try to kind of build ahead of the storm. And I can say pretty unequivocally, we hit sort of a terminal threshold for some of the problems of trust on the internet over the past year. It's only going to accelerate from here. But we've always been trying to get ahead of two problems at once. All I'm trying to do is apply things that have worked in sort of decentralized and distributed systems of finance and try to bring that to the world of information. When we think about ID++, absolutely, we're thinking about trying to track and trace the provenance of the very beginning of a supply chain and say, Robert Friedland's copper. But we're also thinking about, can we take those same systems of information supply chains and apply that to data, right? Right now we have no idea where the content authenticity, starts. Where does that supply chain start? And, as Michelle Identity has said on the podcast, we're swimming not in data lakes, but, data sewers in many ways, because the bad stuff is polluting the good stuff. We don't have the filters. We don't have the refining, right? I think that's another way to look at it. We have all this raw information potential. Think about it like a crude oil deposit, but we need to extract that data. We need to refine it. We need to, make it safe, to be used as jet fuel and the LLMs. That's the sort of the lowest entropy crack of the barrel, right? That's what we need to do with information. So again, all I'm doing is applying what we've done in other systems to thinking about how we do this in information systems. And I think that's where ID++ is so critical, is being able to have those verifiable credentials for not only every individual, but how every individual interacts with every organization, how they act with every piece of data. Again, this is a big task, and that this is, like Smarter Markets, this is a a long-term endeavor. Smarter Markets is not that we know Smarter Markets, but we're just trying to ask the questions and build the systems so that we can always progress Smarter Markets.
So where does identity come in, right? So identity is super important because this is where the trust anchor comes from. But it was a great point last week when you were talking about insurance. And if a bar is stolen versus a bar was lost in accounting, how does insurance come to play? All of that comes down to what I call what would be like a signature skin in the game, right? Who signed that count? Who audited that? It's all that contract law that comes down to an individual signing it, and that individual has some sort of authority or responsibility. They're putting their job on the line saying that, like, yes, I counted this correctly. They said, yes, this forward contract, these performances, I'm signing my credibility to that, right? So the foundation of trust is not just abstract concepts like regulatory and all these other institutions. It always comes down to the individual and that individual signing their identity into a contract. So in my view, digitizing that process in a more secure, trusted way than just passing things around on DocuSign became far more important to seeding trust in the financial system than trying to put something on a blockchain. But the next step from there actually is, again, what we've talked about is smart commodities. Having that digital title, there's things that we can do to be able to have more data than just the pure grade and location. You can have all sorts of other environmental impact or other data in that commodity. And again, that will all happen with a digital title that has much more metadata, much more persistence of data all the way through the supply chain embedded into the digital title. So again, there's multiple layers of getting this technology right, getting our messenger out to market, getting our signing tool out to market, and ultimately our identity and digital title as that pulls it all together.
The systems thinking, I think, is what often gets missed at first blush, because even going back to the very, even before Smarter Markets, when you were with Eric Townsend, the first host of Smarter Markets on his Macro Voices podcast, and you talked about the dimensions of ABEX and the part that was markets, the part that was financial technology, the exchange and clearinghouse, ID++. I think often people would scratch their heads and say, well, these don't seem to be related. But, whenever I talk with you, it's very clear how they're all related. It's the same systems thinking. And it's also related because all these things you're doing are about building networks and helping people use existing networks and systems to collaborate in new and more powerful ways. And so I wanted to ask you, getting those networks going is always a big challenge. Like, what sets this type of business apart, both in terms of the opportunities once it's built and the challenges in getting it there?
Yeah, well, I think it's the recognition of the interconnectedness. And again, one of the first themes that Robert Friedland, mentioned on the podcast is our interconnectedness. But it's fostering those networks and those communities of asking questions, right? That was the point of building the podcast. But I think you're going to start to see in years ahead that we're going to take that from just bringing guests of our ecosystem on to talk about their piece of the system or piece of the infrastructure. And we're going to start moving this more into real time, being able to query different guests at that dinner table. And by the way, not do it sequentially, but do it, everywhere all at once, as the transformer model will allow us to do, particularly as we network it and bring it to scale. So yeah, I think building communities and building networks are foundational to markets for all the reasons we've been discussing. That's absolutely been one of the three pillars of ABEX. Sometimes it gets questioned. Why is an exchange building a podcast? Why is an exchange launching a community? It's because, that in my mind, particularly where information technology is headed, is going to be an essential, if not the essential piece of market building.
Thanks again to all of our guests. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back next week, returning to our podcast series, Gold for the 21st Century. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by ABEX Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, and battery metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact us at sales@abex.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by ABEX. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.